Ash grinds sickeningly between your teeth. The thick stench of charred human flesh and burnt wood clings stubbornly to wool garments, seeping deep beneath the skin and poisoning every frantic breath. The eastern sky is choked by a filthy, oily shroud. This isn't just some common fire. These are the illusions of a once great power going up in flames. The Carolingian Empire sincerely believed in its eternal global dominance. Now, its wreckage writhes in pathetic, humiliating agony. Charlemagne's direct heirs hide in their damp, cold castles, encased from head to toe in Europe's finest iron. And yet, they tremble incessantly with fear. How did the absolute masters of the continent suddenly become hunted prey? Why did centuries of continuous military evolution turn out to be a total farce? The heaviest armor and the solemn blessing of a powerful church meant nothing against the shrill whistle from the boundless steppe. Imagine yourself standing on this earth, soaked in the blood of others. Could you keep a sober mind? Death in these parts hasn't worn bright family crests for a long time. It fundamentally refuses to issue a formal declaration of war. It simply arrives quietly at dawn. Death always strikes faster than the alarm bell can frantically toll. Late 9th century Europe is ruthlessly torn into bleeding, jagged shards. The fragments of former Carolingian greatness are rapidly rotting from within, constantly ripped apart by the petty avarice of provincial German dukes. Local rulers are preoccupied with trivial palace intrigues. They are fatally blind. But real, tangible power no longer belongs to Frankish kings. Power now belongs entirely to the swift shadows, those horrific shadows gliding silently across the eastern horizon. The Magyars. Savage Hungarian horsemen, an elusive, utterly wild force of nature. These steppe nomads make it a point to avoid massive stone fortresses, skillfully bypassing long, exhausting sieges. They simply wipe defenseless peasant villages off the face of the earth. They take only the strongest slaves and burn every harvested crop to ash. And then, they vanish into the morning mist without a sound, always disappearing before the ponderous Frankish cavalry arrives. This is a truly perfect, foolproof killing machine. Its bloody tactics have been honed to perfection by centuries of ruthless survival in the harsh, wild steppe. Dark night falls heavily over the ravaged Bavarian land. A common old peasant sleeps with one eye open, his rough, calloused hands frantically clutching a wooden pitchfork. A wealthy local baron cowardly stashes the family silver in a stinking manure pile. Down in a damp, pitch-black earthen cellar, an anonymous woman presses her hand over her crying infant's mouth with all her might. Her filthy fingers instantly turn ice-cold with primal animal terror. Directly above her head, alien, impossibly swift hooves indifferently trample the remains of her former peaceful life. The dry, thatched roof of the house ignites as expected. Hot sparks fall through the cracks onto the dirt floor. This isn't a fair, noble fight. This is the systematic, frighteningly mathematical extermination of an entire people. While black ash slowly settled on one bank of the wide river, a completely different web was being spun in the high, bright halls, a web of indelible historical disgrace. Proud German rulers finally found a very specific way out. Arrogant dukes and excessively bloated bishops unanimously chose the path of least resistance, the tribute. Gold was generously handed over in exchange for a fragile silence that rang with tension. Heavy oak chests now regularly lumber toward the wild east, stuffed to the brim with pure silver and precious church relics. This is the utterly humiliating, pathetic routine of abject cowards. Cowards who still have the nerve to call themselves the ruling elite. They don't even try to protect their common people anymore. They are simply purchasing a short reprieve. They aren't securing the borders at all. They are just cowardly renting their own worthless lives for a few warm months. The words of one famous chronicler from those dark years sound particularly pathetic. Our deep, unforgivable sins have brought upon us the perfectly just wrath of the heavens. The scourge of God now ruthlessly lashes us with the filthy hands of Eastern savages. It was a very convenient theological excuse for their own blatant military incompetence. It's much easier to publicly blame an angry God than to honestly admit the absolute technological superiority of the composite bow and step mobility. Some people frantically built high stone walls to somehow hold back inevitable death. Others stubbornly forged heavy iron swords, naively hoping to deliver it. But all efforts proved utterly powerless against blind fate. After long, agonizing months of this gold-bought peace, the situation suddenly suffered a critical fracture. Exhausted peasants had only just begun to cautiously sow the new spring crop. The black earth had barely warmed under the sun when the eastern horizon turned black again, threateningly and inevitably. A relatively small band of wild nomads boldly crossed the established border. They did it simply for bloody sport, for quick, easy loot. A total fluke. A stupid mistake by an overconfident nomad leader, or the simple boredom of rank-and-file steppe riders. But it was this small, insignificant raid that became the fatal catalyst. The air grew thick with the distinct smell of a global catastrophe. The smell of their own clammy fear became too unbearable for the Frankish high nobility. The nobles were deathly tired of hiding their shifty eyes from their own subjects. The deep, animal horror of the invisible eastern enemy demanded an immediate psychological release. It hysterically demanded fresh, hot blood. The insulted elite was morally ready to go to any lengths to reclaim their rapidly slipping dignity. The soil for the bloodiest strategic blunder of the decade had already been generously fertilized with peasant corpses and noble silver. Bavaria held its breath, preparing to take the fatal step. The fatal step was taken right into the cold, clinging mud of a spring forest. The Bavarian land exhaled in relief. A group of armed Frankish scouts, hopelessly lost in the thick morning mist, stumbled purely by accident upon a small nomad camp. There was no complex military tactic here, no brilliant generalship. Only blind, banal luck was at work. The wild steppe dwellers were fast asleep, a heavy, deep sleep after a long night raid. A dozen heavy crossbow bolts punched through defenseless human flesh with a wet crunch. Warm blood instantly soaked the withered forest grass. Several nomads thrashed in death throes, while the other shadows vanished instantly among the thick tree trunks. It was a filthy, short-lived skirmish, a trivial, routine border incident. But the Carolingian elite, starved for a resounding victory, clamped onto this pathetic scrap of bloody meat with a death grip. The severed heads of the killed Magyars were dragged across the cobblestones with great fanfare. They were tossed onto the clean marble floor of the palace with such sickening bravado, as if they were the horned skulls of mythical monsters. The illusion of total superiority immediately went to the nobles' heads, hitting harder than the foulest, strongest wine. Toxic, baseless overconfidence instantly flooded the spacious halls. Rulers, humiliated by years of animal fear, grew rapidly drunk on the mere scent of someone else's death. The loud clinking of heavy gold chalices completely drowned out every timid, solitary voice of reason. Wide tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat. Hot grease dripped sloppily onto expensive silk garments. Influential bishops fussily raised their plump, ring-encrusted hands toward the stone vaults, singing church psalms hysterically with strained voices. They competed to assure one another that the Lord had finally woken up and turned his gaze upon their suffering. Strategic blindness became absolute. It was in this stifling, smoke-filled hall that the most insane idea of the decade was born: to wipe the Eastern threat off the face of the earth, to crush the venomous snake once and for all, right in its steppe lair. Assemble 100,000 men, an incredible, utterly fantastic number for those dark times. Forge a giant steel juggernaut. Start the heavy wooden millstones meant to ruthlessly grind the dry feather grass, along with anyone who dared hide there. The commanders openly spat on scouting, believing religiously in massive oak shields and guaranteed divine protection. It was a true parade of pure, unadulterated idiocy. Idiocy safely and cowardly hidden behind the backs of singing priests. Sit at this rowdy banquet table. You are a grizzled, gray-haired baron covered in rough scars. Your thick wool tunic is soaked through with cold sweat. A precious silver chalice is clutched nervously in your gnarled fingers. You watch the cheering, fresh-faced youths intently as they boastfully hack at the air with their shining swords. They have never in their lives seen a feathered arrow flying straight at their faces. You slowly shift your heavy gaze to a trophy composite bow. The alien weapon is tossed carelessly into a dark corner. It is frighteningly perfect. No unnecessary decorations, only lethal mathematical precision. Death in its purest, most concentrated form. A bead of ice-cold sweat runs down your tense back, but you remain cowardly silent. You habitually drown your rising dread in sour wine. The heated crowd loudly demands fresh blood, and to argue with a maddened mob is certain suicide. Grim orders immediately flew to every corner of the vast Bavarian lands. And it was at that moment that the first catastrophe, hidden from view, occurred. The elite completely forgot that their massive army physically did not know how to march for long. It only knew how to stand on the defensive and ruthlessly rob its own destitute peasants. Desperate messengers mercilessly rode horses to death. City squares roared continuously with crowds. Stifling smithies choked day and night on acrid black smoke. Tired blacksmiths hurriedly riveted heavy mail that was absolutely useless in the steppe. Tens of thousands of simple peasants were forcibly torn from their native land, driven into dense infantry ranks like mindless cattle to the slaughter. The incredibly massive, lumbering logistical behemoth began to creak under the strain. While the Bavarians were loudly and conspicuously forging iron, the vast East remained suspiciously, ominously silent. The steppe always knew how to wait patiently. The Grand Prince of the Magyars did not drink sweet wine in warm palaces. He sat for days in a stiff leather saddle, silently drinking bitter mare's milk and listening to the dry reports of his invisible shadows. Skillful scouts brought back perfectly accurate numbers every day. The nomads never believed in miraculous divine intervention. They believed firmly in the cold mathematics of war, in the superiority of speed, and in calculated distance. They watched the enemy with cold, sadistic interest. The heavy, iron-clad prey was voluntarily huddling into one giant, helpless herd. The incredible arrogance of the German commanders had struck them blind. As one overconfident Margrave haughtily declared in those days, "We shall pass through their pathetic tents like a sharp knife through soft tallow." These were empty, meaningless words, the stupid words of men accustomed to spending their lives besieging immobile, silent stones. They went forth overconfidently to punish savages, but they fatally forgot the most important, immutable rule of survival. Some people pray loudly for victory just to drown out their own animal fear, while others simply draw a bowstring in silence, to cut that naive prayer short forever. The bowstring was stretched to a breaking point, but instead of a swift, light arrow, a giant, lumbering mass of steel tore away from it. The hollow prayer of the Bavarian nobility materialized into the most suicidal march in the continent's history. 100,000 men, an incredible, monstrous mass of living flesh. This boundless human tide crawled east along the wide banks of the Danube with a heavy, prolonged groan. But this was not a river of life. It was a filthy, stinking river of acrid sweat, horse piss, creaking, ungreased wood, and dull, heavy iron. By the end of the first month of summer, the ruthless sun had scorched the foreign land into a monolith of searing stone. The air above the road shimmered thickly with unbearable midday heat. Fine, all-pervading dust from hundreds of thousands of feet instantly clogged nostrils and inflamed lungs, settling in a thick gray layer on sweaty faces and turning living people into faceless, slowly crawling statues. The heavy cavalry, the undisputed pride of the Frankish crown, became the primary victim of its own excessive pomp. Expensive, skillfully woven mail, forged for brilliant parade victories, quickly turned into portable ovens. The metal no longer protected against enemy sabers. It slowly and brutally cooked its arrogant masters alive. Horses wheezed, dripping thick white lather, and dropped dead right in the dry ruts of the road. No one even thought to move their massive, bloated carcasses. The once great army simply marched blindly over the rotting corpses of its own animals. Squeeze into the very middle of this suffocating column. Become, for a minute, a common foot soldier from a destitute Bavarian village. Your thin shoulders are chafed raw by the coarse leather straps of your rucksack. The wooden shaft of a heavy spear is stuck fast to your filthy, calloused hands, as if fused there. Your mouth is bone dry, like an old, long-abandoned grave. You greedily swallow murky water that reeks of warm silt, but the liquid brings no relief. It only tears at your inflamed throat with renewed force. Beside you, your comrade coughs heavily and convulsively. His eyes roll back. He falls onto the sharp stones, devoid of strength. No one stops. Hundreds of heavy, iron-shod boots indifferently trample his screaming face into the dry mud. You silently turn away. You haven't been marching for the glory of the crown for a long time. You just dully move one worn-out foot in front of the other in a blind, instinctive hope of surviving until the sanctuary of the night camp. While rank-and-file soldiers fainted by the thousands from severe heat stroke, the High Command was issuing grand decrees. The commander-in-chief of all Bavarian forces, the ambitious Margrave Luitpold, and influential church hierarchs sat in spacious, well-ventilated tents. They looked importantly at crudely drawn abstract maps. They saw beautiful, straight lines on expensive parchment, but they had absolutely no understanding of the real terrain. And they cold-bloodedly committed an act of pure, unadulterated strategic suicide. They divided their colossal machine. The single iron fist was voluntarily sawn into 3 independent parts. The first column crawled slowly along the northern bank of the Danube. The second trudged gloomily along the southern bank. The third group, along with heavy supply trains and cumbersome siege engines, clumsily floated downstream on lumbering, overcrowded boats. The great river, which the generals intended to reliably bind the army together, suddenly turned into an impassable barrier. The columns completely lost visual contact. Complex logistical chains snapped in the very first week. Communication between commanders vanished entirely. 100,000 men became blind and deaf overnight. This was no longer a formidable offensive army. It was a giant, paralyzed procession of the damned. Cumbersome wagons with vital provisions became hopelessly mired in deep riverside mud. Wooden axles snapped with a loud crunch under the excessive weight. Precious grain rotted under the open sky. Hunger began to collect its first silent harvest long before the appearance of a real enemy. Iron military discipline rapidly disintegrated like dry furnace ash through trembling fingers. Starving soldiers began to fight brutally among themselves for a pathetic scrap of moldy bread. The powerful Carolingian beast was methodically devouring itself from the tail up. But the Margrave, stubbornly, with a fanatical glint in his eyes, drove this rotting behemoth forward. Blind pride would not allow him to publicly admit the looming catastrophe. He believed, with a saintly, childlike faith, that the savage enemy would scatter in panic at the mere sight of their countless crosses and banners. The massive army continued its agonizing movement east, leaving behind a wide, foul-smelling swath of broken wagons and unburied bodies. They crawled heavily, with clanking and groans, straight into the devil's open maw. Logistics proved to be a far more efficient executioner than any sharpshooting steppe nomad. The stupidity of their own commanders, that was the most terrifying weapon of mass destruction. Some people drew plans for grand conquests while looking at smooth tables, while others simply waited in silence for the enemy army to destroy itself on the grueling march. 100,000 men, armed to the teeth but utterly exhausted, sank step by step into the hollow silence of the Deadlands. The deathly silence of the Deadlands swallowed the massive army whole. The Frankish vanguard stepped heavily across the scorched grass. Not a single sound. No barking of thin steppe dogs. No lowing of cattle. No crying of a frightened child. Only the maddening, rhythmic creak of ungreased wagon wheels and the dull thud of tens of thousands of heavy boots on the dry, cracked earth. This terrified the soldiers more than any fierce battle cry. The anticipation of certain death is always worse than death itself. Ahead, through the dusty, choking haze, the outlines of the first Magyar settlements appeared. The infantrymen frantically gripped the wet shafts of their spears, the veins in their filthy necks bulging. They prepared for a brutal massacre. But there was no one left to slaughter. The villages stood completely empty. The abandoned clay hearths had long since gone cold. Dilapidated thatched roofs sagged forlornly under the gusts of a dry, biting wind. Bavarian warriors fell upon these pathetic remnants of someone else's modest life with the ravenous greed of starving curs. They scurried through the dark huts, kicking in flimsy wooden doors with brutal boots, searching desperately for hidden grain or even a single gulp of clean water. Nothing. Not one rotten grain. Not a tiny, murky puddle in the parched wells which had been intentionally filled with sand. The nomads were gone. They had taken absolutely everything with cold, calculated precision. But the German commanders, blinded by hubris, saw this ominous silence as a grand, undeniable triumph. Walk up to the stone-filled well in the very center of this abandoned settlement. You are the Margrave's young standard-bearer. Your parched throat burns unbearably from the day's thirst. You drop a wooden bucket into the deep black hole. A dull, mocking thud echoes against the dry stone bottom. No water. You raise eyes, red from the caustic dust, toward the horizon. There, in the shimmering, stifling air, dark, jagged outlines emerge atop a high green hill. Pressburg, an old wooden fortress. Your exhausted heart beats joyfully against your ribs. There it is, the primary and only objective of this endless, grueling march. The enemy was simply terrified. The enemy had cowardly hidden behind fragile wooden walls. You shout this joyfully to your weary comrades, failing to grasp one simple, lethal fact. You are shouting words of victory while standing dead center in a mousetrap that has snapped shut forever. The wooden fortress of Pressburg beckoned the exhausted army like a life-saving oasis in a vast desert. The massive military machine, hopelessly divided by the river, began to slowly converge on this rotten phantom of long-awaited victory. Commander Luitpold issued loud, confident orders with a look of triumph, absolutely convinced of an easy, nearly bloodless win. Heavy cavalry, their useless iron armor clanking loudly, prepared for the final, picture-perfect charge. Siege engineers lazily inspected their lumbering wooden engines on heavy river barges, looking forward with lustful anticipation to a swift assault on the dilapidated fortifications. No forward recon, no security details on the overextended, defenseless flanks. The German warlords swallowed the bait whole, accompanied by loud hymns and pompous prayers, and with it, the sharp steel hook. The invisible Eastern enemy watched their every absurd, clumsy movement with total composure. Thousands of narrow, inscrutable eyes watched intently through the thick brush along the Danube. The wild steppe dwellers didn't make a sound. They breathed in unison with the dry wind. Their small, incredibly hardy horses stood absolutely still, as if carved from dark, rough stone. The loop of a giant, invisible snare tightened silently, inch by inch, around the lumbering Bavarian host. Common soldiers collapsed by the hundreds from monstrous fatigue, but their noble commanders were already mentally divvying up non-existent wealthy spoils. Fat, self-satisfied archbishops gave high-flown blessings to the exhausted infantrymen for the righteous storming of those empty wooden walls. Meanwhile, steppe centurions distributed sectors for the upcoming mathematical extermination, with short, dry nods. The silence around Old Pressburg became absolutely unbearable. It weighed heavily on slumped shoulders, far more than any iron chainmail. It was a thick, sticky silence before a colossal human meat grinder. Some men naively and sincerely believed they had finally cornered a stupid, wild beast. Others, simply and silently, with terrifying calm, were locking the flimsy gates of a massive, sour, sweat-soaked wooden slaughterhouse. The dull thud of a heavy log, the dry crack of splintered planks, a thick cloud of acrid, suffocating dust. The wooden walls of Old Pressburg seemed like a laughable, toy-like obstacle for a 100,000-man armada. But the old, rotten wood suddenly proved tougher than Bavarian steel. Thus began 12 endless, agonizing days of a slow, viscous nightmare. Every new, furious assault foundered in its own useless rage. The heavy cavalry, the elite of the Frankish nation, milled about pointlessly at a safe distance from the walls. Expensive horses nervously gnawed on dry iron bits. The haggard infantry beat their heads against the wall in a stupor, time after time, without any visible purpose or a single chance of success. Cumbersome siege towers became hopelessly mired in the loose, trampled earth. Long wooden ladders snapped with a loud crunch under the excessive weight of bodies encased in thick iron. This wasn't a proper, classic siege. It was the slow, shameful execution of a massive army through total exhaustion. The sun ruthlessly and methodically burned away the remnants of human sanity. The heavy, scorching air of the camp smelled thick with unwashed bodies, soured wine, and old, acrid sweat. The giant host was running out of meager supplies with frightening speed. The mad march had devoured almost everything. Hunger began slowly twisting empty soldier stomachs into tight, painful knots. Irritation grew with every wasted, useless minute. Noble German lords took out their impotent rage on the common spearmen, beating them with heavy leather whips and driving them against the cursed wooden walls again and again. But the walls stood stubbornly, and the Magyars weren't defending the fortress in the way the Franks understood. They were playing with the enemy, calculatedly dragging out precious time. Their tactics were a perfect, sophisticated torture. Small, stinging, unbearable pricks. At night, a dozen short arrows would suddenly fly out of the pitch blackness, finding their soft targets in the dark with frightening, mathematical precision. By day, small mounted detachments would burst out of the dusty haze, loose a short, synchronized volley, and then instantaneously dissolve back into the steppe. No one in the camp could sleep properly. No one could even drink water in peace. Stand in the very front ranks of the attackers, you are an ordinary, scrawny Bavarian carpenter. You were forced to push a heavy battering ram. Your bloodied, bare feet are ankle-deep in sticky mud that reeks of human waste. The unhewn log grinds your right shoulder down to the bare, white bone. You breathe heavily, with a wheeze, the persistent taste of rusty iron and dust in your mouth. You look up despondently at the time-darkened, jagged logs of Pressburg. Boiling tar doesn't pour from there, as you were taught in the militia. Heavy, round stones don't fly from there. Instead, a short, dry, barely audible whistle periodically breaks from above. The man to your right suddenly chokes on his own gurgling scream. A thin wooden shaft with gray bird feathers protrudes deep from his filthy neck. You drop the ram in terror, falling to your knees right into the liquid, rotten muck. You frantically cover your head with trembling hands. You no longer want any great glory for your king. You just want that horrific, monotonous whistling to stop. But it doesn't stop. It becomes the constant, methodical rhythm of your own personal, earthly hell. 12 days of continuous, sadistic attrition. The once great, invincible army was rapidly falling apart, slowly turning into a ragged, vicious mob of mad drifters. Commander-in-Chief Luitpold cowardly barricaded himself in his massive silk tent, categorically refusing to believe the panicked reports of his officers. He fastidiously ignored the mass desertion that had begun. Fatal pride had sewn his eyelids shut with heavy thread. He still blindly, childishly waited for a general engagement, craving an honest, open, face-to-face fight. But the cunning nomads were simply squeezing the last drops of life energy out of the Bavarians in cold blood. They were in absolutely no hurry. The boundless steppe always operates on its own unhurried clock. Every silently murdered night sentry, every grain wagon burned in the rear, every sleepless night full of animal fear, all of it worked flawlessly toward a masterfully calibrated plan. The Magyars controlled the distance with surgical precision, giving the Franks no chance to retreat in shame, nor to break forward in heroism. The filthy, monotonous routine of the siege killed military discipline more effectively than the worst plague. The fat archbishops finally stopped singing their solemn psalms. Their well-fed voices had gone hopelessly hoarse from the road dust. Out of desperation, the common soldiers began boiling old leather belts, trying to trick their empty, cramping stomachs. A suffocating, paralyzing anxiety crawled through the massive camp like a cold, slimy snake's belly. The stupidity of the high rulers finally, shamelessly exposed its hideous core. A colossal mass of armed men found themselves securely trapped on a tiny patch of land, under fire from all sides, divided by a wide river, and exhausted by endless hunger. Bled dry by hundreds of small, nameless skirmishes, they still naively thought they were besieging a defiant fortress. They still sincerely believed they were formidable, invincible hunters. Some men built great empires in their empty fantasies, while others simply forced them to eat rotten leather in someone else's mud. The hunt had ended long ago. The invisible steel trap had snapped shut for good. The nomads simply gave their stupid enemy time to wear himself out, cold-bloodedly winning precious days for the stealthy approach of their main forces. The illusion of control was bound to vanish. And it vanished cruelly, one misty, cool morning, a morning when new, frighteningly endless shadows suddenly began to grow silently on the quiet horizons. The shadows grew in absolute silence. A thick, milky white morning mist slid slowly, reluctantly down the gentle slopes of the green hills toward the cold waters of the wide Danube. Bavarian sentries squinted habitually against the caustic dust, leaning listlessly on their heavy, long spears. They were just waiting for another dismal, hungry day of a filthy siege. But this day had no intention of being boring. It was rapidly preparing to become the final day for the flower of the Frankish nation. The mist suddenly tore to shreds. It wasn't just gray river vapor that dissipated. In one short, blood-curdling second, the great, lethal illusion vanished forever. The Bavarians weren't besieging anyone anymore. Above the horizon, riders rose in a steady, endless line. Tens of thousands of horse archers. This was no pathetic handful of random steppe scavengers. This was the main nomad army. The perfect, flawlessly coordinated machine of total extermination had finally arrived at its rightful workplace. They didn't shout furious battle cries. They didn't beat loud drums for intimidation. In this absolute deathly silence lay the purest, most concentrated animal terror. The steppe cavalry formed up in regular, mathematically precise crescents. Methodically, inch by inch, they closed off every possible path to salvation. A giant, invisible steel noose tightened around the neck of the Carolingian host with a dry, snapping sound. Icy shock instantly paralyzed the massive camp. Thousands of exhausted men froze in place as if rooted to the spot. Sweaty, filthy hands went limp. Heavy blacksmith hammers clattered into the dry mud. Stomachs eaten away by long hunger, cramped with painful, unbearable spasms. Arrogant hunters, who only yesterday greedily dreamed of rich eastern spoils, were transformed in an instant into pathetic, cornered prey. The roles reversed with cruel, mocking speed. The massive, lumbering German army was tightly boxed in. On one side, the deep, cold river. On the other, an impenetrable living wall of bows and sabers. Death didn't come for them in the form of a beautiful, noble battle. It came as the ruthless, industrial culling of livestock. Feel that sharp, icy prick right in your chest. You are a young groom in the retinue of an influential Bavarian archbishop. You are kneeling by a filthy puddle, trying to scrub ingrained, dried blood off an expensive master's saddle. You slowly raise your head at a strange noise. Your gaze locks onto a boundless sea of horse muzzles. The air around you suddenly becomes unnaturally thick. You can't even take the shortest, most frantic breath. Your beaten legs weaken treacherously. You desperately want to run, but your muscles are filled with heavy lead. You turn to your powerful master. The fat prelate convulsively clutches the massive gold cross on his chest until his knuckles turn white. His plump, rosy cheeks suddenly turned deathly pale. In his pupils, dilated with horror, you see with crystal clarity the exact reflection of your own inevitable demise. At that very moment, you realize one simple truth. All the gold crosses in this world won't stop a well-aimed arrow. You are just a piece of doomed meat in a very bad, God-forsaken place. Panic crawled rapidly through the cramped ranks, faster than a dry steppe fire. Dukes who had bragged loudly tried with frantic, trembling, disobedient hands to don their ceremonial chainmail. But the heavy iron no longer provided a false sense of security. It suddenly felt like a cold, personal, cramped sarcophagus. The heavy cavalry, once the invincible pride of the empire, proved to be utterly useless. Their massive, tired war horses couldn't even build up a proper gallop for a shock charge. The vital space for maneuver simply did not exist. The Bavarian host was fatally divided, utterly exhausted by days of hunger and completely demoralized. And now it was brilliantly surrounded by the superior forces of a cold-blooded, absolutely pragmatic enemy. The Magyar commanders looked upon the scurrying Germans with the disdainful, cold pity of experienced butchers. They were in no hurry to begin the mass slaughter. They skillfully gave the animal terror time to properly steep. Sticky fear broke men's wills far more effectively than heavy siege stones. Frankish commanders hysterically shrieked contradictory orders, their voices cracking. They waved heavy swords insanely, trying to form the panicking infantry into a tight, circular defense. But the closed formation was already trembling treacherously. The famous iron discipline crumbled right before their eyes. The great army, pompously sent to expand the empire's borders, had turned into a pathetic, whimpering crowd of terrified dead men. Some men overconfidently built high walls out of their own ambitions, while others simply set those walls on fire from all sides. The trap didn't just snap shut, it ruthlessly crushed the very idea of Frankish military superiority into fine dust, leaving behind only a naked, whimpering survival instinct. An instinct that could no longer help any of them. No one is getting out of here alive. The square of the doomed frantically closed its heavy, useless shields. Heavy, cumbersome oak shields slammed together into a single wall with a dull, doomed thud. In total despair, the Bavarian infantry tried to hunker down in a tight, circular defense. A closed wooden formation had always reliably saved them from frontal assaults, but the Magyars had absolutely no need for honest, nightly clashes. The steppe answered this pathetic shell with a mathematically calibrated whistle. The sky suddenly, frighteningly darkened from tens of thousands of launched arrows. This was no chaotic, blind barrage. This was the systematic, perfectly tuned operation of a massive assembly line. A non-stop conveyor belt at a giant human slaughterhouse. Death arrived strictly on schedule, in steady, unbearably thick waves. Each wave took its exact, greedy toll in human lives. The impotence of thick Bavarian armor against long-distance warfare became absolutely obvious. Shields quickly splintered into kindling. Expensive iron chainmail was pierced through. The proud European infantry just stood there, dying submissively and methodically under a ruthless foreign sun. Squeeze into the very middle of this doomed steel box. You are a Bavarian spearman, pinned in from all sides. Air is catastrophically, agonizingly scarce. The thick stench of sour sweat, stagnant urine, and fresh blood clogs your inflamed lungs. You press your thick shield hard against your trembling chest. Your filthy fingers have turned white from the unbearable tension. All around is a continuous, maddening, piercing whistle. The man to your left suddenly slumps with a quiet, wet wheeze.
You instinctively take a short step sideways out of animal horror, immediately stepping on a slippery, weakly twitching body. From the right comes the loud, sickening sound of punctured metal. Another man falls heavily under your battered boots. You see absolutely nothing, only the sweaty back of the comrade standing in front of you. You are just standing in a blind, dark, incredibly stifling prison. You submissively wait for your inevitable turn. Claustrophobia is slowly, surely, and cruelly driving you insane. This endless waiting for the fatal blow burns out your sanity much faster than the scorching summer sun. Impotent, burning rage finally broke through the dense Bavarian ranks. The proud German knights absolutely could not endure this sadistic, mocking execution. Their frayed nerves snapped first. The heavy cavalry burst from behind the protective shields with a loud, utterly insane roar, throwing themselves headlong into a furious counterattack. They desperately wanted to force an honest melee, but they attacked an absolute, mocking void. The steppe riders turned their incredibly fast horses with ease, almost playfully. They retreated with total composure, continuing to shoot continuously and with lethal accuracy, even at a full gallop. Every Magyar arrow unerringly found a vulnerable spot in the heavy Frankish armor. Massive, exorbitantly expensive war horses collapsed into the dry dust with distraught screaming. Bavarian nobles in heavy steel tumbled head over heels onto the scorched earth, snapping their fragile necks with a crunch. They suffocated shamefully under the unbearable weight of their own pompous iron. The attempt to chase the free wind turned, predictably, into a literal act of collective suicide. The sun was merciless, methodically picking off the few lucky enough to still be standing. The sweltering heat mowed men down just as effectively as the long Magyar arrows. There hadn't been a drop of drinking water for 2 long days. The soldiers suffered agonizingly under the relentless blaze, greedily gulping down their own warm urine straight from their filthy iron helmets. They were losing their minds en masse to a wild, gut-searing thirst. The massive army was slow cooking in its own juices, bleeding out profusely inside a tight, inescapable living ring. The execution continued with a terrifying mechanical monotony. There was no storybook heroism from the old ballads here, no glorious, memorable feats of valor. There was only a methodical, utterly cynical, and mathematically precise slaughter. The pride of the Frankish crown had finally withered into a pathetic, whimpering target, a massive, living target for the routine practice of Eastern archers. Suddenly, the dense, monolithic Bavarian line wavered with an unnatural tremor. A crowd of thousands of doomed men swayed in unison as primal, animal survival instincts finally crushed their vaunted military discipline. Panic reached its critical, irreversible boiling point. Heavy, knightly armor proved to be the most expensive and utterly useless headstone in the history of the continent. Exhausted men suddenly realized the absolute futility of their reliable circular defense. Standing their ground meant a guaranteed agonizing death, yet blind terror had paralyzed their ability to think straight. On one side, men methodically drew taut composite bows without a shred of emotion. On the other, men in a bloody hysteria shattered their own life-saving formation forever. Commanders lost the final, pathetic vestiges of control. A cornered, wounded beast prepared for its final leap, a desperate, meaningless dash straight into the gaping maw of inevitable doom. The bloody, sticky mud underfoot became unbearably slick. The agony of a blind breakout was now inevitable. The agony of that breakout didn't take long to arrive. The human psyche has a strict breaking point,
and the taut strings of their nerves finally snapped with a deafening, painful ring.
The giant steel box of the infantry square shattered. The singular, disciplined organism ceased to exist. In its place emerged a crazed mob, howling with primal horror. Tens of thousands of Bavarian soldiers cast aside their oak shields and dropped their heavy spears. They forgot pride and military honor forever, possessed by a single blind instinct. Run. Run anywhere, just to survive. Direction no longer mattered. They surged through a choking wall of dust straight toward the river. The broad Danube seemed like their only hope for salvation. But it was a fatal, monstrous mistake. The fleeing men instantly became perfect targets. The Magyar archers didn't even bother to aim carefully anymore. They simply loosed arrows into the massive heap of living flesh. It was physically impossible to miss. Heavy-armed warriors tripped by the thousands over the corpses of their comrades, falling into the viscous, blood-soaked mud. The rear ranks blindly trampled those who fell, iron-shod boots crunching through the arms, ribs, and skulls of their own countrymen. The saving water turned out to be a merciless grave. Exhausted men in heavy chainmail leaped from the banks and went straight to the bottom. They drowned by the dozens as murky, bloody bubbles rose to the surface. Picture yourself in the very center of this insane crush. You are a high-born Bavarian knight. You have forgotten your long lineage forever. Your expensive weapons were lost long ago in the chaos. You are running with all your might along the slippery bank, air wheezing from your chest in ragged gasps. Behind you, the fast, rhythmic thud of hooves grows louder. You don't look back. You feel the cold breath of a stranger's horse on your neck. A short swing. A heavy, blunt blow crashes into the back of your head. You fall face first into the murky river water. The metallic tang of your own blood mixes with swamp silt. You try to stand, but someone else's hobnailed boots ruthlessly grind your face deep into the muck. You are no longer a proud aristocrat. You are just a piece of meat. You are nothing but an obstacle to the others trying to run. The collapse of discipline was the greatest gift the steppe dwellers could ask for. They immediately ceased their long-range bombardment. The nomad cavalry, with short, dry yelps, slammed into the crowd. A systematic, mathematically precise sweep of the area began. This was no longer war. This was routine work at a filthy slaughterhouse. The steppe riders maneuvered easily among the infantrymen, their short, curved sabers methodically dealing fatal blows. A swing, a fall. Next. The Magyars worked without rage, cold-bloodedly butchering the crazed herd. The flower of European knighthood whimpered pathetically. The elite of a powerful nation crawled on their knees, begging for mercy in a language the enemy didn't understand. But mercy wasn't on the books for today. The absolute chaos of the butchery finally swallowed the once great army. The vaunted military treatises of the Carolingian era turned out to be pathetic scrap paper. Heavy armor became a death trap for cowards. Speed and pragmatism brutally crushed sluggish grandiosity. The screams of hunted men gradually drowned in the monotonous lapping of the river water. In their panic, the massive army was killing itself far faster than the enemy blades could. Terror proved to be the nomads' most effective ally. Some men naively hoped to save themselves by fleeing, cowardly abandoning their brothers in arms. Others simply herded them cold-bloodedly into the deep water like blind, helpless kittens. The trap had devoured its prey. But a mob always dies in the most humiliating way. It never remembers its heroes. In this horrific mess,
the main culprits remained. The very men who had arrogantly led the army to certain death. The high commanders, proud margraves and bloated archbishops.
They could no longer hide in their cool silk tents. Crazed panic had ruthlessly spat them out into the sticky mud. The elite suddenly found themselves in the exact same position as the lowliest, poorest militiaman. The laws of survival make no concessions for noble birth. They were about to personally meet the logical conclusion of their own grand arrogance, and that meeting didn't promise to be pretty. The merciless sky of a foreign land watched their agony with indifference. Death was already staring them point-blank in the face, preparing to teach the nobility its final, ruthless lesson. The beautiful chivalric myth was over. It drowned forever in the coastal swamp muck with a loud, disgusting squelch. The commander-in-chief of the Bavarian army, the powerful Margrave Luitpold, slumped heavily to his knees. His magnificent warhorse had long been dead, its thick neck pierced through by a crude wooden spear. The proud banner bearing ancient family crests was hopelessly trampled into the bloody mud by his own fleeing soldiers. His heavy breastplate no longer signaled high social status. It had turned into a perfect iron sarcophagus, a sarcophagus the old Margrave submissively carried on his own battered shoulders. Dozens of thin steppe arrows bristled from the joints of his insanely expensive armor. It looked utterly ridiculous. The once all-powerful arbiter of an entire empire's fate now resembled a massive, clumsy hedgehog, a hedgehog being brutally kicked by filthy militiamen in their blind panic to retreat. No one rushed forward to selflessly shield their lord. His loyal bodyguards had fled like cowards, selling their master's life cheaply for a few extra minutes of their own pathetic agony. There was absolutely no heroic pathos, no beautiful, noble, dying speeches about love for the fatherland. The great generals died in the filthiest way possible. They choked on their own thick, warm blood. They greedily, convulsively swallowed dry road dust mixed with horse manure. Influential archbishops, who only yesterday spoke with authority in the name of God himself, now crawled pathetically on their torn bellies. Heavy gold crosses dragged their thick necks to the ground like merciless millstones. The spiritual lords wheezed hoarsely, clawing at the tough roots of coastal bushes with well-manicured, ring-adorned nails. They desperately tried to buy their lives from the riders passing by, promising the nomads massive oak chests of pure silver and entire blooming cities. But the invisible eastern shadows had no use for the empty words of dead men. A short whistle of a curved saber, a dull, wet thud. Thick crimson blood soaked into the expensive, light-colored church silk. The steppe always takes what is hers without tedious haggling. Drop to one knee right into this hot, unbearably slippery red puddle. You are a noble ruler of vast, wealthy lands. Your distorted mouth is wide open in a silent, strained scream. Your inflamed lungs burn with the fires of hell. You try to pull a short, feathered arrow from your pierced neck. Your unresponsive fingers, encased in heavy iron gauntlets, slip helplessly over the warm blood. They won't obey you at all. You struggle to lift a blurred, fading gaze to the sky, desperately searching for the familiar, guaranteed, divine support. But the sky above you is absolutely indifferent. It is terrifyingly alien. Calm, clean white clouds drift slowly across it. This cold sky couldn't care less about your incredibly long lineage. It doesn't recognize your loud, pretentious titles. Suddenly, the bright sunlight is blocked forever by the dark silhouette of a Magyar horseman. He doesn't even look you in the eye. To him, you aren't a great lord at all. You are just an annoying, soft bump in his mount's path. You see only the short, merciless swing of a curved blade.
And then comes the eternal, cold darkness.
Your overinflated ego pops like a rotten blister on stagnant swamp water. The elite of Carolingian Europe was cut down to the very root. Nearly 20 influential Bavarian counts, 3 incredibly powerful bishops, the commander-in-chief of the massive army himself. Their brilliant, centuries-nurtured culture of warfare turned out to be an absolute sham. Until their very last, wheezing breath, they sincerely believed in their inherent superiority. They arrogantly considered themselves the pinnacle of military creation, but harsh reality taught them a brutal, uncompromising lesson. In the dry, pragmatic equation of survival, the weight of expensive armor always loses outright to the speed of a flying arrow. The nomads gathered this rich, bloody harvest methodically, without the slightest emotion. They made it a point not to take noble prisoners for ransom. They simply, cold-bloodedly, like peasants in a field, cleared the territory. They broke the back of the enemy nation forever. A dead commander-in-chief will never raise a new punitive army, and his rotting, mutilated corpse would become the ultimate warning for all future generations. Dead bodies rapidly covered the ground in a thick, foul-smelling carpet. The air became permanently saturated with the unbearable, sickly sweet stench of mass death. 100,000 hacked, trampled, arrow-riddled men slowly cooled under the scorching eastern sun. Shining ceremonial armor quickly tarnished under a thick layer of sticky mud and clotted blood. Just a few short hours after this insane slaughter began, the proud, giant army ceased to exist forever. A terrifying, absolutely unnatural silence fell. Only the dull, satisfied cawing of massive flocks of crows broke the peace of this endless, spontaneous graveyard. The victors went about collecting salvaged weapons with businesslike efficiency. They crudely ripped heavy gold chains and rings from the cooling corpses, doing it disdainfully and mechanically, the way simple Bavarian peasants harvest turnips. The highest nobility of the continent ended their long, ambitious journey on the filthy shoulder of history. Some men, until their final moment, believed sacredly in the infallibility of their great crown, while others simply turned that crown into a piece of dented, blood-stained metal. Their grandiose ambitions were ruthlessly ground into fine powder. But the most terrifying, most cynical trial awaited the slain ahead. For rotting corpses are physically incapable of writing chronicles. Abandoned in the mud, ground into dust, these bones would very soon become a convenient foundation for an entirely new reality, formatted by fear. While the bloated black crows were busy finishing their dirty work on the banks of the broad Danube, a completely different kind of work was brewing in cool monastic cells. Something far more terrifying. A great bureaucratic silence was taking root. A massive national tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of rotting bodies. An unprecedented rout. But thin parchment can endure anything. The surviving court hypocrites showed startling efficiency. A catastrophe of such colossal proportions was simply impossible to acknowledge officially. It shattered the very foundation of the crown's divine right to rule. Therefore, they decided to simply erase it, to blot it out forever from the official memory of an entire people. After several long years of ringing silence, history was completely rewritten. Sharp quills scratched across expensive calfskin with the monotony of a funeral bell. Methodically, letter by letter, they were killing the fallen soldiers all over again. Court chroniclers mentioned only a minor, completely insignificant border skirmish, devoid of any emotion. They deftly juggled dry facts, masterfully transforming the greatest disgrace of the Carolingian era into a regrettable misunderstanding. The state machine demonstrated absolute,
crystal-clear cynicism. Power always protects only itself. Sit down at this rough oak table in the dim scriptorium. You are an old, hunched monk. Your gnarled fingers tightly grip a thin wooden quill. The pungent smell of sour ink has permanently stained your withered skin. You slowly trace the beautiful, even letters of a new chronicle. You submissively write of the incredible wisdom of the rulers. You praise their tactical genius. But your blind eyes betray you, tearing up. It isn't from the dim light of the tallow candle. You know the truth. Your own younger brother was left to lie forever in that cursed, nameless mud beneath the old wooden fortress. His abandoned body was long ago dragged away by steppe wolves. But right now, obeying the strict order of the fat abbot, you cold-bloodedly strike your brother's very existence from history. You place a beautiful, ornate period. You have just committed the most despicable betrayal of your life, and you will have to carry this heavy cross until the very end. The survivors of that horrific meat grinder sincerely envied the dead. The few broken, mangled men who miraculously crawled back to their native Bavarian lands were met with icy contempt. They returned home without eyes, without arms, their psyches permanently shattered. But the motherland greeted them with freezing disdain. They were a living, constantly whimpering reproach to a cowardly government. They were quickly and quietly hidden away in the deep, damp cellars of remote forest monasteries. They were forced into silence forever, left to rot slowly in total, absolute oblivion. The state had no use for screaming witnesses to its blatant, criminal incompetence. The state needed a flawless, shining reputation. And the price of that reputation proved to be truly monstrous. But it was precisely in this sticky, nauseating lie that the most terrifying historical paradox lay. This grandiose bloodbath buried more than just people. It buried the old, incredibly stupid knightly tactics forever. Meaningless parades in heavy iron became a thing of the past. The foolish faith in pompous prayers instead of thorough reconnaissance was ruthlessly trampled by the hooves of light horses. On the smoking, blood-soaked ashes of old Europe, a completely new order began to rapidly emerge, formatted by sticky, animal fear. Far more cruel, far more pragmatic. The kings finally learned this uncompromising lesson of evolution. The future great empire would not be built on empty promises and gold crosses. It would be built on steely, ruthless discipline, on precise mathematical calculation, on total, suffocating control. The tomb-like cold of the eastern steppes became the perfect forge for a new, soulless statehood. Naive romantics were left to lie forever in foreign soil. Their places were taken by cold, calculating cynics. They learned to build impregnable stone strongholds. They learned to strike treacherous blows first. They forever transformed their own fear of the nomads into the perfect weapon for the mass suppression of their own citizens. Some men cowardly hid the truth in deep, dusty archives to preserve their pathetic power at any cost, while others simply used the shattered bones of others as the most reliable foundation for a new, iron world order. Evolution has absolutely no morality. It recognizes only raw, effective force. The catastrophe was surgically transformed into a starting point. The truth always loses to a well-organized state lie. Millions of future descendants will sincerely believe in the crystal nobility of their ancestors. They will never know the smell of sweat, urine, and panic-stricken terror that hung like a thick fog over the Danube. And therein lies the main, darkest irony of human civilization.
What is more terrifying? To die from a nomad's arrow in foreign mud, or to find out that your death will be cowardly struck from the chronicles to save the reputation of the crown?